All right, so I answered most of the art-related questions in the last Q&A, so I'm going to do some other questions. In your experience, do you like the West or East Coast better, or do they each have their own distinct features that make them unique? Yeah, they both have unique features, and I appreciate both coasts. So for me, the East Coast is New York, New Jersey, Mid-Coast, Maine, and Cape Cod. Those are the areas that I have most experience in. Growing up in New Jersey till I was 14, I'd go into New York City with my dad. He worked there, and then we would vacation mostly on Cape Cod, and then more recently going to Mid-Coast, Maine. So, and then on the West Coast, my experience has mostly been California. In fact, it's all California. I haven't been to Washington or Oregon yet. That's going to change. But, so my experience has been primarily Northern California, but I went to school in San Diego, and now obviously I've been going to Los Angeles. So my West Coast experience is California. So things I like about the East Coast, really like the architecture back there. A lot of great architecture near the water. I love that because I like painting houses near the ocean. In California, you don't really get that. Most of the coastline here is really undeveloped and wild, which is great. But there's very few places to paint kind of interesting architecture with, you know, in a sort of coastal setting. Very little of that. And because most of the coastal areas, at least in Northern California, are kind of foggy and rugged, and so they were just mostly used for farming. So the few houses that are built out there are just very utilitarian and boring looking. So not interesting. So anyway, yeah, so I really appreciate that, the architecture of the East Coast. Also, I appreciate the seasons there. I remember, like, I have wonderful memories of, you know, watching snowstorms out the window and, you know, praying for a snow day, you know, or, you know, going out like after a snowstorm, everything's so quiet, and there's some really beautiful things. Or fall, just the smells and the colors of the leaves and everything. And then in springtime, you know, when you get those first few warm days and maybe the robins come back and you get, like, you know, the bulb flowers are starting to bloom, like tulips, and then the forsythia, those yellow plants, that starts blooming. I remember just being like this feeling of such joy on those days, you know, after dealing with like several months of winter. All right, so for the West Coast, I really appreciate the grand scale of the landscape here, and the fact that there are so many undeveloped and wild areas really close to a metropolitan area. So I live like 15 minutes from San Francisco, and yet I can also in 15 minutes be in a beach area that feels very remote and undeveloped and beautiful. So that's something that on the East Coast you had to drive a long way to get to wilderness, and it wasn't the same kind of wilderness you get here. So California, most of the development is in like kind of pockets or whatever, and then outside of that there's tons of open space. And there's a huge variety too. Like, you know, it's amazing that you could be at a beautiful coastal place, and then within, like, say 3.5 hours, you could be at a place like Yosemite. So there's just a tremendous amount of variety here. So I appreciate that as a landscape painter. And also just there's something nice about that, the feeling that I can be walking in the redwoods, or I can go down to the beach, or I could go up to, like, say, Yosemite, or I could go up to the High Sierra, or there's lake areas. The Central Valley has its own beauty. And then there's a whole area north of San Francisco. There's 500 miles up to the Oregon border where that's a whole area I haven't even explored. So there's a lot to explore here. And I really appreciate that part of California. Like I say, also I really appreciate the climate here. In particular in Northern California, it's kind of breezy and cool, and just a great climate, overall climate to live in and work in. Southern California was a bit hot for me, in particular late summer. I went to school in San Diego. Now as far as culture goes, when I'm back east, I miss taquerias. Like, I like going to taquerias, and they're all over. You know, you can always get a burrito somewhere, and as you guys know, That's, I love doing that, and I always miss burritos. Actually, though, Emma was saying that she misses Northern California burritos now that she's down in Los Angeles, and they definitely are different. I think California has always been a place that has drawn a lot of people, especially a certain type of people that are looking to make their fortune, first with the gold rush, or then Los Angeles, like to go into show business or whatever. And now like there's a lot of people drawn here for technology or biomed. There's a lot of things happening here that draw people from all over, pretty much all over the world, but all over the country. But then it's expensive to stay here. So there's kind of like, there's people from everywhere, and it's constantly changing. Whereas the East Coast, I think maybe, and I could be wrong about this, but my feeling was people kind of stayed put more. There's a kind of a transient population in California. And I've heard some people say that the friendships from, in California are not as lasting, or they don't run as deep as they do on the East Coast. I don't know if that's true. I will say though that a lot of my friends out here are from the East Coast. All right, so that's my take on things, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you have experience on both coasts? Share it in the comments below. And as usual, thanks for hanging out, guys. I will see you in the next video.